Okay, we're going to continue with the Farbrengen of Yud Shvat, Tafshin Chovav 1966, learning the first Sicha. The Rebbe was talking about the idea of Mazar B'chaim, Afu B'chaim. Just as the children are alive, so too exactly Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, based on the Gemara that says Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov doesn't die. And the Rebbe was explaining the idea of what is it. To understand what does it mean, Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov doesn't die, you have to understand what does it mean Yaakov's alive. When we understand what it means Yaakov's alive, then you understand what it means Yaakov doesn't die, because the life of a tzaddik is Chaim Ruchnim. So much so that it's even more than just primary, secondary. But then that the secondary, which is the goof, the body of the tzaddik, is like almost like a garment. And just like a person is alive, whether they're in a garment or not, and when you take off the garment, it doesn't change. It just changes that you're no longer dressed. So too, the tzaddik is so connected to the spiritual versus the physical that the physical is just like a garment, and therefore leaving the body doesn't change, because that was never the tzaddik's life. And therefore, although the tzaddik has the conditions of being in the physical body, for instance, like we said before, you have to make the brachas, etc. If you want to make a bracha, you have to make a bracha on eating food, and it's the hand that puts on the tefillin and all that, but it doesn't change the fact that everything that the tzaddik does is though it's being done, could be physically, but it's connected to the ruchnis. And therefore, as long as the tzaddik is alive, that's the garment. And when the tzaddik goes to the next world or passes on, the tzaddik is still alive. It's just no longer in the garments of the physical. But the effect that the tzaddik has, meaning with the tzaddik's chassidim, talmidim, zare, with the children of the tzaddik, both physically and spiritually. So if you see that his children are alive, so too the tzaddik is alive. And the Rebbe is going to go deeper and deeper into this explanation. Meaning to say the point is that Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov didn't die. Why? Because we have to understand what it means Yaakov is alive. And then and the Gemara shows us the Mazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim. But again, like the Rebbe says, not that the children are living a legacy influenced by the tzaddik. If you see the children are alive, you know the tzaddik's alive. Why? Because as we're going to see now in today's class, and maybe the next class, how the life of the tzaddik has an effect on the zari and the children, on the descendants, on the talmidim. And from analyzing talmidim, you can understand that Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov didn't die. Okay, let's continue. Sifches. Rebbe says, Umayi, to make sure that it's on the YouTube properly. Okay, so it's like this. Umayi aichacha, she'inin achaim hu ba'ofen she'ruchni su iker. What's the proof? How do we know if this person is a tzaddik? Not like we said before, but some people that they could be a tzaddik, but they're secondary, or their goof, the material is also important. So much so that the taste of the food, for instance, could be mavalvel them in making a bracha. For instance, if it disturbs them, the taste, and therefore they don't like it, therefore they can't make a bracha and they can't make a proper bracha. So what is the chacha? What's the sign? How do we know on the person in question that we're saying loy meis that didn't die? How do we know that this person's primary is the ruchnius and anything else is at best secondary? A gashmis any elotafel baba. The gashmis are only secondary. And therefore it's loy meis. Why? Because the chaim of the tzaddik was chaim ruchni, like the Alter Rebbe writes in the Geras HaKodesh, Elahu b'chaim, and therefore he's alive. And what's the so he says? What's the chacha? How do we know if the tzaddik is a chaim of ruchnim? So that Rebbe answers, when you analyze the children and you see that the children are chaim, which is going to be explained in a second, that shows you that the life of the tzaddik wasn't a chaim gashmim or chaim ruchnim. Again, we're not just talking about a person who lives just for material. When the person's connected, becomes the primary, stays material, even if they're doing everything. Torah mitzvahs, they're tzaddik. But how do we know if their life is a chaim ruchnim? Then you have to analyze Zari B'chaim. Do you look at the Zari, look at the descendants, look at the Talmidim, and you see that they're Chaim? That's a sign that the life of the Tzaddik was Ruchni, and therefore he's B'chaim. And that's the meaning, Mazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim. You could see from the Zari, almost sort of say a scope that you could look into, and this shows us who the Tzaddik was. Rabbeinu Zakim Mevar B'Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, chapter 35, 32, when it talks about the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. That a person who their body is the primary, benafshem tefela, and their soul is secondary. In the very famous chapter Lev, which is the chapter of Avos Yisrael and Tanya. So one of the things that the Rebbe explains over there, it's very important to understand that it's impossible for a person to have true Avos Yisrael as long as your goof is ikar. If your body, your physical is the primary of who you are, on the highest level of Avos Yisrael, it's still you can't get out of yourself. And there's some sort of self there, and therefore it's not Avos Yisrael. Avos Yisrael, when it's not about you. When is it totally about the only way it can be totally about another person if your primary is not your physical. As long as your primary is your physical, so then you're separate from the next person. So he says, again, whoever's life is gufa mikra, that your primary is your body, benafshim tefela, and your soul is secondary. You can't have true avos and love between two people. How could you properly love someone like yourself? It could only be when your soul is your primary and your body secondary, and therefore you're not limited with the physical, and therefore you have the ability to properly connect with someone else. But in a case where so that's the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that you have nafsham ikar and gufam tafel, that if your soul is the primary and your body is the secondary, then you can have true Avos Yisrael. Here it goes even further. However, when a person is living a life, that their body is not just a secondary, it's not even a secondary. The goof and gashmias of the person, the body and the physical of the person is not at all an entity. It's not primary or secondary to the person. So then, so then what does it mean we have to the Riyacha Komoicha, that the Komoicha is not just that you have because your primary is your soul, therefore you're able to connect on your primary to the next person, but there's still a secondary of your body. But when you're totally don't even have a secondary, a body that's a secondary, meaning to say Shahanoisin Gam Lazulis, that Hanu Shahanoisin, Shanoisin Gam Lazulis, that everything. He leirak ba'ifin shatafel Hanu Gam Lazulis, you even give to the other person everything. But in the case, sorry, let's do this again. Let's start again from the paragraph. However, when the person's body is not even a secondary, then but has no entity at all. Then the key is obvious. So then it's not that you have a secondary. Meaning to say, because your primary is your gu, is your nefesh, therefore you're giving everything to the other person. But you have also for yourself. Aber Beifin schon Messas der Gamer gibt sich in ganzen Appelsus vad shesachayim shlo yarihu machtir miyasim. Setzt der rein bizarre ich mismaser azus lahachitz b'tar mitzvos. The Rebbe says it's such a level when it's not just that you don't even have a secondary of body, and therefore you give yourself absolutely 100% over to the next person. And in the case over here, we're talking about a spiritual father, a Rebbe, to the Chassidim. To the Zulas over here is the Chassidim, that you give your entire life to the Zare, that so that they should be able to live in Torah mitzvahs. Meaning to say, Zare b'chaim. What does it mean that the children are alive? Pirusha, the translation is Sheroyim Shaha'uvda Sheploini Hu b'chaim. When you look at the next person, meaning the student, the Zare, and you see that person's alive, Shuchai b'Torah mitzvahs. What does it mean alive? That their life is Torah mitzvahs. Any el b'glal hiyesizare. How could that person be alive? What gives what gives the person the right to be alive? And what ability is this person living Torah mitzvahs? Because you say, oh, you know that person's living Torah mitzvahs. You know how that person's living Torah mitzvahs because he or she's a chassid of so and so. So Talmud is a zari of so and so. The reason why zari is b'chaim is because there's zari. And why? How is the zari b'chaim? Because the father, so to say, Yaakov Avinu, gives everything over. And when you give everything over, you're able to give your full life, so that person also is alive. And this Yehudi, we're talking about a Yid, the Rebbe says. Shechai u'musalach ben hagoyim. You're living amongst the Gentiles. You're living in the world. V'yesh le'kol inyanim shebayim mitzad nafshi b'amis. And the person has, like everyone else, an animal soul. So how are you really alive with Torah mitzvahs? How do you overcome this challenge? Yitzhak Ra, you have Yitzhar of Oilam, the world around you. You became Ketzid Efshar Lachis. I say, how could you give that person life? How could you turn that person to be alive in the translation, meaning alive in Torah mitzvahs? There's a Hegab Atzvacham. Imagine. Isa Medrash, the Medrash says, if you gathered non-understanding with all the artificial intelligence. But the fact is, if you gather all the people together, try to create a single mosquito, or lahalvin kanaf echad, or to make a proper wing of a mosquito, and it's not possible. You can't create actual life. And what do we say? That this person shouldn't be alive spiritually. Almost like, what gives this person a right? How is it possible this person's alive? They're saying, well, you know why this person's alive? Because he or she is Zari. Because you're the descendant of so and so. And because you're Zari, because you're a student, a Talmud, spiritually, a child of so and so, therefore you're alive. So what does it mean? That means that you should, otherwise you wouldn't be alive. So the Medrash says you can't create life. You can't create even a mosquito. How can you create a person Torah mitzvahs? Therefore, the Rebbe says, this that we're saying that you can't create something. That's when you are a creation, another creation can't create another creation. I was talking very strong Russian here. When the tzaddik is like the creator, like we said before, it's not that your nefesh is ikr, your nefesh is primary, your goof is tuffle, but you have a tuffle of a goof. You're totally not a mitzvah for yourself. Your whole mitzvah is the ruchnis. You're only a conduit, you're a messenger of the creator. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Torah last week of the idea of tzivakos. That the tzivakos is Hashem himself. The Eibusher makes through you that this person should become a creation. This person should become a person of Torah mitzvahs. The Rebbe says more than that. Person could ask another question. I was saying, Mori de Geverter over here. What do you mean? Okay, fine. So he's a shliach of the Eibusher, and therefore, just like the Eibusher create, so the tzaddik is creating that this person should be zare, meaning a zare b'Torah mitzvahs. But even Hashem, it says, God doesn't decide if someone should be Yerushalayim. That's up to the person. So how do you say here that the person that Zare is B'chaim is because he's Zare, or she's Zare? The fact that you're a descendant, you're taking, Zare means, what the Rebbe is saying over here, is that, what it means, Ma Zare B'chaim, it's not just even a simon. The fact that you're Zare is the only reason why you're B'chaim. If you're not for being Zare, you wouldn't be Chaim. Especially, we're talking about Chaim Ruchim, even Chaim Gashim, the Rebbe says, at least in the tape. The fact that you're here today is because you're Zara. The fact that you're Zara, that's why you're B'chaim. And that's why it's a simon of Mazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim. What kind of tzaddik is able to make that Zara should be B'chaim is a tzaddik who has a total Chaim Ruchim, and therefore the tzaddik never passed away. So you can ask the question, but the Eibusher himself doesn't give you a Shemaim. How can this person make Zara Chaim? How could the tzaddik make that this person should be zara, that this person should be b'chaim, because he or she is zara, is a chassid, is a talmud. Seemingly God himself, God himself doesn't decide if someone should be God-fearing. That's because that a yid can do. Right? The Rebbe says, because Hashem said, and again, analyze the actual words, v'yahavta d'reyecha k'moicha mamish. It's mamish like you. And by the Eibusher giving the mitzvah, v'yahavta d'reyecha, he empowers, so to say, lahavdil, a yid to be able to be more powerful than the Hashem himself. Where Hashem is a kol b'dei shemaim chutz min Yerushalayim, but a tzaddik can make that zara. If you're zara, then you're b'chaim. Mikoshkem kavchem emsichem litin leidavar gashmi k'dei lahachis es nafshay. Because in theory, the Rebbe doesn't say this, but seemingly what the Rebbe is saying is if you have to give the person gashmis, right? If a person's hungry, You say, it's my job to give the person food. God give the person food. Why do I have to give the person food? The guy says, no, of course, you have to give the person food. In that case, you're stepping in even more than God. God will not feed this person. If you don't give that person food, the person will die from hunger. You're stepping in and doing something even more than God is doing. God has not provided, you did provide. He's providing through you. Although if not for you, then he wouldn't provide this way. Because you're here to give tzedakah, he's giving through you. Although there's havish luchan l'makan. So the Rebbe says, if you have to give physical, even more so, you have to give spiritual life to this person. To be on that level, it's not everyone could be on that level. It has to be a person who's totally, not just tafel, not the goof from tafel, that the goof is secondary, and your nefesh is only primary. You have to be totally batul mitzias. So what the Rebbe is saying more in this class, from what we learned yesterday, is it's not just that we're talking about an nafshim ikar goof from tafel. It's going even further than what it says in Paraklamed Bay, that for this way of Chaim, it has to be mamish totally batul mitzias. You have to have no mitzias of gashmis. Remember to this, batul mitzias. He explains in Tanya in Paraklav. Bekivan shezehu inyan shetzarach lavi v'poil etzel azulas lemasbik bitul mitzias b'koyach el tzarach liyas bitul mitzias b'poil. And the Rebbe says, in order for it to be that you're actually going to give life to the next person, it's not that the tzaddik has potential to be nullified. The tzaddik is actually mamish. The mitzias doesn't exist, and therefore there's no such thing as meis, because that's the chaim is a chaim that there's no mitzias, there's no entity, there's no feeling of self. And when do you see this? When you see this person who's giving themselves totally over, it gets a chavek in God's in your moisin nafshin ad kedekach moisin serious nefesh. The Rebbe's talking about a Rebbe. The Rebbe's pushing moisin nefesh lahachis is to give life to someone else. The person can say, 1 second, there's limits. How much do I have to give to myself for someone else? The Torah says chayechem koydim. Your life comes first. So actually have mesirus nefesh for someone else, self-sacrifice for someone else. The tzaddik at this level is not having this conversation with themselves, measuring how much you have to give halachically to the next person. Moisin nafshi, the sees a person who needs, gives. Levad liyahachis Yehudi is long to give someone else life. This is we learn from the leaders. We're talking about Mazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim, applying this now to the older Nesiach Chabad. Heichel Mi'admar Zakim, starting from the Alter Rebbe, we saw this idea of Bitul Mitzirus, which means Mesiris Nefesh. 100% for the next person, totally giving everything to the next person. And therefore, when you have that total Bitul B'Mitzias and total giving over of everything to the next person, you could create Zarai that they should be B'chaim. Including up to the Rebbe says to the Previous Rebbe. To do just a favor for a Yid, that's not Chabad. That's Shulchan Aruch says you have to do a favor. This is not what Chassidus came to teach a person to do a favor Yid, to do a favor Yid. What Terech came to add over here, Chassidus came to add. Like the Rebbe spoke before, and I think that Yid Eskislev was the famous in the Havan in Yani Terech Chassidus. And Tashin Chavav Yid Eskislev. A Pirish HaTorah. Chassid, what does it mean a chassid? A chassid doesn't just do the max up into what halacha says, but you give even everything of yourself. Like it says about burning the nails. You're ready to burn the nails, you're ready to put yourself in danger. Shaltev says well, to do a favor for another Yid. We found this, that I'm saying, coming tonight onto Yud Shvat. You see this by the life of the Baal HaYilula, the Previous Rebbe. Super Pam, as the Rebbe told, the Peterborough, Zman Tsar, in the time of his father. He wasn't even a Rebbe then. He was a young boy. But he went to Petersburg, a whole story on Shabbos, to be able to be the battle, to nullify a decree. He had to spend Shabbos in a pub. Everything was dangerous. The whole thing was dangerous to maybe be able to nullify a decree that they had against the Jews. That was totally self-sacrifice. This was on a doubt. Maybe to nullify a decree on Jewish people was a decree on Kashmirs, if I'm not mistaken. But even if it was Baroknis, the Friedrich Rebbe gave his life up, put his life in danger to be able to possibly change the mind of the Gzera. But we find this more b'shnais in this Yosef when he became Nasi, when the Friedrich Rebbe was Rebbe. Medina, with how the Previous Rebbe had pushed itself, serious nefesh, as we all know. Self-sacrifice of the Rebbe Riyatz and the Previous Rebbe. In Medina, he means in Russia under the Soviets. There were years when the Previous Rebbe lived there every single day. From the beginning to the end of the day, his life was in every moment was involved in self-sacrifice and danger for both his physical and spiritual health. He didn't do it for himself. It wasn't like he needed to have a high spiritual level, and therefore he was self-sacrificed. If the Previous Rebbe would want to sit in his own library and study Torah, and study by himself, if he wanted to perform mitzvahs on the highest level himself. The communists wouldn't bother. They're not going to bother the Previous Rebbe to try to change the Previous Rebbe. He shouldn't be put on tefillin. They wouldn't touch it. Why would the Previous Rebbe live a life? In what way did the Previous Rebbe live a life of self-sacrifice? That he wanted to have a live chassidim, and he was successful, and he affected. He gave up everything. That the Zara, his chassidim, should be alive. And this can only be to give such life, to have this power is only when a person, when they live as their soul in their body. Like he says before, that even when he was alive, not only wasn't his life, that his physical life wasn't just a primary, there wasn't even a secondary of physicality. The physical is nothing. Although again, it doesn't affect how the Previous Rebbe had to do mitzvahs. The Previous Rebbe made a mitzvah when he ate a piece of bread. He made a shahakal on a glass of liquid, eating a piece of meat. But his whole life was all about the ruchnius. Because the physical, whether it's the mitzvah, whether it's the body, was all just vessels, like clothing, garments. How he could be effective in the world. So when the garment is needed, he's in that garment. The garment is no longer needed or changed, he goes to another garment. But he's alive. There's once his chaim 100%. So the Rebbe starts off the Sicha trying to officially building a case to show that we stay with Yaakov Avinu Loimeis. The end of the Sicha that I was going to, that's not the Chiddush of Yaakov's life. The Chiddush is that his children are alive. And the very fact that you see his children alive, how are they alive is because because they're Zaroi. And we're talking about such a person that the Chaim is such a Chaim is ruching him, and therefore he's able to have that the Zaroi should be a Chaim. Chiddush is that the children are alive, that the Chassidim are alive. Nimtza, who sees more than this since Gimel Tamas of Hatzlacha. Chassidim are having shluchim, men, women out there, young people that never even saw the Rebbe Abim Matzliach in a way that's no one ever seen before. In history, we haven't seen before. Why? Hazari b'chayim, because who b'chayim? V'nimtza sha'uv d'shezari b'chayim mahava hichacha sha'afu b'chayim. So when you see that the fact that the Zari are alive, because he's alive, otherwise the Zari wouldn't be alive. Don't mean it's lacking the physical body, but that's not who he is. Like we said before, to understand what it means Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, you have to understand what it means Yaakov Avinu Chai. Now he had another, then he had one garment until Tavshin Yud, till Tavshin Beis, and now there's another garment. Yaakov Avinu Leimeis. And this is what the Gemara means. Yaakov didn't pass away. Yaakov's not dead. Why? Did they not eulogize him? Did they not preserve him? You look at Yaakov and look at his descendants that are living in Mitzrayim. The same thing applies throughout the diaspora, throughout the generations. And you say, why? How are these people living like this? Why do they have the koyach to be so alive? It's because they're Zari, because the chassidim of the Rebbe. Then you never understood what he mean he was alive in the first place. When you look at a chassid today in 5,786, and you see this hatzlacha of a chassid that the b'chaim is because you never understood what it meant he was alive the whole time. It wasn't a chaim dashmin. is because the Rebbe was Chai Ruchni, is Chai Ruchni. כשרואים שיעקב הם זר בארץ מצרים, וכל סך, ולחס בשאר גול, ורואים שהם חיים בגלל היסם זרי, הרי זו הכרחה שמשך כל שני זה ויעש לחיים לכם. You didn't understand what it meant that he was alive in the first place. ואילו הגשמיס היסר לא רק עניין של תוכו, אלא גם לבוש בבד. It was only a garment. It wasn't just a secondary, like a secondary of a primary. It was just literally like a garment, which is much less than a secondary. He's the same kind, if not, and not that, even more so. The change is only in the garment. He, like a person who changes clothing. You're not going to say, now you're dressed in a suit, you're a different person. You could look like a different person. You could say, you could compliment the person, they look better, sharper. Same person, it's the same me. There's people who like to judge people by the book, by the cover. So you say, oh, if a person looks like a shlemazel, maybe they're a shlemazel. You look at my clothing, look at how I project myself. That's not me. It doesn't change me whether you think it or not. The Rebbe continues and we'll go a little further. I think let's see what the next Sicha is. Anyone? Yeah, so let's, we're not going to finish the whole Sicha, but let's just finish one more paragraph. When it comes to Yud Shvat, the Hilula, Kasher Misas from Yachto, we gathered together. Kamashan Malachir, already years after the union of whatever happened on the Yom Hilula. Yoidim Shesiftus of Daina Mechantachatai, we say you said eulogies, and we put on and there was the burial, all the things, the anointments, etc. Rabbi Yosef and the Alter Rebbe tells us, Shakashem Duber Oid Sadik Shbechaim Chayusah B'Yaisa in Shem Baguf Kan Lamata B'Sar Tvachim V'Yuchayiv Leichaim Sar Melchaim Ruchim. We're talking about such a person. In this world, that wasn't their life. It wasn't their ikr. It wasn't their tackle. It was like a lavush, and their whole life was ruchniim. This thing is no life. There's no longer a life. There's no such thing as Yaakov Avinu meis. Yaakov Avinu lay meis. That doesn't change the fact that they eulogized him and they put him in and they put the body in preservatives, but that wasn't him. And these are the things halakhically you have to do to a person who goes when the body is no longer here. This is only the physical garment of the tzaddik. And now the tzaddik is in a better, the Rebbe says, a better garment. On the contrary, like the Alter Rebbe says in the Gersa Kodesh, any limitations the tzaddik had up until this point is no longer there. That's why again, mamish we see from Topshin and Daled, the Hatzlacha Chassidim had gets stronger and stronger every year. The Hatzlacha is growing. What was Hatzlacha in 1994? You can't even compare it to the Hatzlacha in 1904 and 214 and 224 and 226. Once upon a time, there was a limitation of space, and you had to go to a certain place because that's where the tzaddik was if you wanted to speak to him. All those limitations are not here anymore. You could sit in America, you could sit in Eretz Yisrael, you could sit anywhere in the world, right, and connect to the Rebbe. In the same way you would be connecting to the Rebbe if you had to go to fly to New York at certain times. The proof is when you look around and gather together, you look around and see the fact. You see the fact that there's people alive spiritually. And the Rebbe adds, the very fact that they're alive spiritually is why they're alive physically. The Chayim Ruchnim of the Chassidim gives the Chaim Gashmin. And why they're alive Chayim Ruchnim and Gashmin is because they're Zareh. Because Gashmis and Ruchnis is one by a Yid. You see, Beglal Yes is Zareh because we're his Chassidim. When you see that the children are alive in Torah mitzvahs, Gashmis and Ruchnis, they're living alive here and they're alive in another country. All over the world. The Rebbe says even in Russia at the time. And they're able to have Mesiras Nefesh. That's a sign that he's alive because the fact that Zara B'chaim is because who's B'chaim? Who b'chaim? The Rebbe says the Rebbe is alive. You're not as if alive. Or chaim im pirushim, or to try to explain it, it means this or it means that. Like the Rebbe said for Vaser, sheilim chaim mit pshetlach, trying to give this kind of twist or spin to it. You look at the children, you see, just like you're not going to give a spin how the Chassid's alive, you're not going to give a spin how the Rebbe is alive. The fact that you see a person is able to conquer the world is because Zari b'chaim is because b'chaim. Because the Rebbe is alive now. Right, we're going to stop here, of course, and wish everyone a meaningful Yud Shvat. As Hashem will continue tomorrow.